Minister Chancellor, His Excellency Dr. Thabo Mbeki, Chair of Council, Dr. Musia, and members of Council, Principal and Vice Chancellor, Professor Bullion Ngabula, members of Senate, members of University Management and Extended Management, esteemed professors, Professor Mokon Simon Mapadimeng, our main guest and celebrant for today, members of the university community, respected guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our Vice Chancellor, Professor Bullion Ngabula, it gives me great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to Professor Mokon Simon Mapadimeng's inaugural lecture. Let me acknowledge Professor Zethu Ngosi, Executive Dean, College of Human Sciences, Professor Patel, Professor and Head of Sociology and formerly Dean of Humanities, Gondwana University, and Professor Mapadimeng's family, friends, and loved ones in attendance. We proudly congratulate Professor Mapadimeng on his achievement as he presents his inaugural lecture in celebration and recognition of his promotion to full professorial rank. We join his family in their pride and thank them for the support they offered him. Professor Mapadimeng's inaugural lecture comes during a special time when South Africans are celebrating 30 years of their democracy. This is the time when South Africans are taking stock of their achievements during these 3 decades of their freedom. One of the major mandates for the higher education landscape remains the redressing of the past imbalances in education. Even though doors of learning are now opened, we still hear about many challenges today, including high failure rates, high dropout rates, and learners who cannot read with comprehension, amongst others. The most common argument given as the cause for the high failure rate is the use of foreign language as a medium of learning and teaching. This could be the reason why in the late 80s, some universities introduced academic intervention courses such as English for Science, English for Maths, English for Commerce, English for this and that. Apparently, this type of interventions did not yield the desired results. That is why even today, higher education is still battling with the challenge of high failure rate. In their quest for an enhanced education system, in 2015, students called for a transformed education that is basically calling for a decolonized one. Professor Mapadimeng's presentation titled Indigenization of Education Through African Languages in South Africa, Afro-Optimistic Perspective, comes at a time when universities are trying all their best to decolonize the curricula. The title of his presentation in particular, the Afro-Optimistic Perspective, gives hope in the sense that it is positive and it shows possibilities in its approach. Often presentation touching on African languages lament the status of African languages that is often relegated to the periphery of the education system, always coupled with the view that even the speakers of these languages frown upon the study or usage of their own languages. Thus, from the onset, one already sees insurmountable challenges that the decolonization is not going to be possible through the use of African languages. Approaching his presentation from the Afro-optimistic angle, Professor Mapadimeng gives one hope that despite the prevalent challenges, there are opportunities, there is hope, there are possibilities. Through the presentation, Professor Mapadimeng will engage the broader higher education landscape community and will share his experiences on his PhD journey. His experiences, his views, his plans for the use of African languages in education will be explained to us. This is a field in which Professor Mapadimeng hopes to continue the long tradition of UNISA for shaping futures as he seeks to indigenize education through African languages. As he shares his experiences and achievements with us, he will surely share his future plans. I invite you to relax, listen, and reflect on how Prof. Mapadimeng's plans to achieve his goal are explained to us. In terms of today's proceedings, Professor Ngosi will thereafter introduce Professor Mukon Simon Mapadimeng and will invite him to the podium. After Professor Mapadimeng's presentation, Professor Patel will follow to give his response on the lecture without further announcement. I now invite Professor Ngosi to the podium.
On behalf of the Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Dr. Thabo Mvuyelwa-Mbeki, and the Principal and Vice Chancellor, Professor Puleng Lenkabule, and the Acting Registrar, Professor Seboda, and the respondent, Professor Dhanraj Patil, who is a professor and head of sociology and formerly Dean of Humanities at Gondwana University, Gadchiroli, Maharashtra State, India, and Fellow of ICSSR, Ministry of Human Resource Development, Indian Government, and Usingaye, Professor Mukong Simon Mapadimeng. Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you all. It's my pleasure and gratitude to introduce Prof. Mapadimeng to the audience. Professor Mukong Mapadimeng started his academic career in 1996 at the then University of Natal, now known as University of KwaZulu-Natal, since 2004, where he served as lecturer and later senior lecturer in the industrial, organizational, and labor studies and sociology. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Sociology, a Bachelor of Arts Honors in Industrial Sociology, and a Master of Arts in Industrial Sociology, all obtained at the University of Witwatersrand. He also holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Industrial, Organizational, and Labor Studies obtained from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Professor Mapadimeng left the UKZN to join the National Arts Council of South Africa as research manager. He later took a position of Associate Professor of Sociology at the Northwest University in the Mafikeng campus, followed by a further move to the University of Limpopo as a full professor of sociology. He is a former research director at the Human Science Research Council. He then joined UNISA in 2022 from University of Mpumalanga, Nelspruit, from the Mbombela campus. Prof. Mapadimeng is the ex-president of the South African Sociological Association, known as SASA, and former member of the Executive Committee of International Sociological Association. He served as the editorial convener for the Journal of SASA, the South African Review of Sociology, and also as a member of the Board of Association of Non-Fiction Authors of South Africa, known as ANFASA. His research interests are in industrial sociology, sociology of development, with special interests in the role of culture, arts, and land, indigenous knowledge systems, social problems, research methodology, and sociological theories. He peer-reviewed accredited journals, book manuscripts, and book chapters. He successfully supervised honors, masters, and doctoral students. He is a widely published scholar with book chapters, journal articles, edited book volumes, and scholarly reviews, as well as conference papers, including keynote and presidential addresses. His recent publications include 2 co-edited books, respectively titled Contemporary Issues in Africa, Cases in Gaborone, Kampala, and Durban, which was published in 2010, and a Handbook of Sociology of Youth in BRICS countries, which was published in 2018. In addition, he has published scholarly papers, including more recently the Youth Theory in South Africa and Indigenous African Perspective, and Youth, Emancipation and Theologies of Dominance, Domination, Resistance, Assistance, and Prosperity, which was published in 2021. His latest publications are an edited book titled Indigenous Knowledge System, Recognizing and Harnessing Their Worth, which was published in 2022 by Juta and Company Ltd. He has published numerous journal articles titled The State of Indigenous Foods in Africa, The Case of Mancon Community in the Northwest region of Cameroon, and Indigenous African Foods in Decline. A study of changing consumption patterns within the Barolong Bu Rashidi community in the Northwest province of South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, you could see that Prof. Mapadimeng has really contributed to the sociological field and has contributed widely with his niche area which talks on youth, food, and security. Currently, he is an M&D coordinator in the Department of Sociology, and also he assists the chair of department by being the secondus and also represent the college in various committees. May we give Prof. Mapadimeng a round of applause as he ascends the podium to deliver his inaugural lecture titled Indigenization of Education through African Languages in South Africa, Afro-Optimistic Perspective. We wish you all the best, Prof. Mapadimeng. Please take the platform. Thank you.
Greetings to Professor Buleng Lengabula, Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Professor Mologo Sebota, Acting Registrar, Professor Zetu Ngosi, Executive Dean of College of Human Sciences, Professor Azwingwisi Mabandu Mzusi, Director of School of Social Sciences, Professor Danraj Patel, our respondent, my family members and friends, colleagues, members of the members of the community at large, ladies and gentlemen. It will be incorrect of me to proceed without giving veneration and respect to the highest power of life and the Badimo ba Babagolo, Dikakapa, specifically to my departed parents, my dearest mother, Hunadi Mujaki Helen Mapadimeng, and my dearest father, Mashagwani Moloto Mutodi Mapadimeng, and my grandparents, both maternal and paternal, including Mashagos Fate Mapadimeng, Mpele Machura Mapadimeng, Mugun Ramba, Lissoyu Ramba, Mahue Ramba, and right up to Rahulukuku Hoshi Mpele Marei Mampana and Hoshi Mogotladi Khezane Mampana. Ke a le leboga go menagane ba kone ba ntšhi dikgolo le lena ba kwena matabalaka a mantle. I wished also to give respect to my late friends and colleagues who are now in ancestral realm, Professor Pakiso Mukhahlane, Professor Idumele Mmekwa, Mucholoko Dr. Zulu Matabo Zulu, Mr. Gilbert Skabate Masimola, and Professor Ishwa Modi, as well as Advocate Opa Mutawu. May you continue to be peacefully rested. Today, I choose to address you on the subject that I know was and has always been closer to our hearts as the historically colonized, and if not resolved, our true emancipation as Banabatari, Abantwana Bempeleko, will remain nothing but a pie in the sky. That is the question of indigenous African languages and their development and how they could be harnessed to indigenize and decolonize our education in South Africa. It is an undisputed fact that colonialism and its cousin, apartheid, have had a devastating impact on the lives of the colonized people as Africans and our essence as a people with rich heritage and history. As this system sought to vigorously negate our history as a people and obliterate our existence. This remains stubbornly so to this day, as the eminent Kwesi Kobra aptly laments, and I quote, "The imprint of colonialism dies hard. Neocolonialism, or the extended lease of life of structures and epistemological assumptions of the colonial era, linger on with little question. In Africa, by and large, and so successful has the imperial intent and colonial program been that the native ruling classes, inheritors of the colonial state, remain blissfully oblivious of the inhibiting and pernicious legacies of colonialism," close quote. In South Africa, this stubbornness was achieved and solidified through a battery of racially divisive and demeaning policies and laws, and their attendant social institutions that systematically undermined and suppressed the indigenous African institutions, casting doubt about their value and significance. To reverse this agonizing legacy, the post-94 government committed itself to eradicating the inherited inequalities and divisions through radical transformative policies and legislations. In so doing, the government was trying to achieve what in my indigenous language, Sepedi, we call go hlomola motlwa ka motlwa o mongwe. Guided by the colonial constitution, the national constitution, the government introduced among such policies as the 2004 Indigenous Knowledge Systems Policy and the 2022 Language Policy for Higher Education. These were informed by the need to promote multilingualism through the development of indigenous African languages, and second, by the recognition that education is part of culture and that culture is transmitted through education. This is consistent with Pra's assertion that language is a cultural attribute that serves as the transactional grid on which the whole social process is operated and articulates the social basis of culture as a shared and defining asset. The need to integrate the historically repressed African indigenous knowledge into educational curriculum was therefore recognized not only as the measure of redress and social justice, but also as a strategic intervention that would give the nation and its peoples a competitive and comparative advantage in a rapidly globalizing world. Vice Chancellor, in my lecture today, I shall provide a critical review of the existing discourse and the policy efforts aimed at supporting and developing indigenous African languages as scientific languages and languages of education. I shall also give attention to the progress, if any, made towards realizing this crucial goal, as well as implications thereof for indigenizing education systems as part of decolonizing effort or decolonization efforts. In so doing, I shall provide a brief outline of the nature of African indigenous knowledge systems themselves and the role they could play in Africa's development including in transforming and turning the colonial education system on its head. I shall then examine the actual state of indigenous African languages in South Africa, preferably Azania for obvious reasons, as important cultural resources and embodiment of African indigenous knowledge and wisdom. The implications of harnessing them to transform and indigenize as well as decolonize the education system will equally be given some attention. In so doing, I shall place under scrutiny and critique the perspective that I describe as Afro-pessimistic and juxtapose it with the Afro-optimistic perspective in my argument for an urgent need to support the development of indigenous African languages as instruments to decolonize education. Using the Afro-optimistic perspective, I argue that notwithstanding the historical malicious intention of the colonial and apartheid system in South Africa that sought to obliterate indigenous Africa's heritage and traditions, including languages, not all has been lost. That's my argument. There is still hope and opportunity to fully resuscitate and develop our languages into scientific languages of education for the purposes of teaching and learning. This is especially so as the colonial and apartheid racist strategies that were meant to prejudice and sideline indigenous African languages, as with other malicious actions in life, had some unintended consequences. Rather than achieving the complete marginalization and underdevelopment of indigenous African languages, I argue, the separate development policies of Hendrik Verwoerd's idea of peaceful coexistence or neighborliness, ironically, provided space for their growth and development, albeit limitedly so. This suggests a ground for optimism, for resuscitation and further development of indigenous African languages and creative integration into the education system. Vice Chancellor, I now wish to turn my attention and explain to the issue of the concept of IKS and explain what is meant by it. A growing interest in the African IKS, or indigenous knowledge systems, was necessitated by the post-colonial condition, marked by the attendant priorities, including the need to restore and revive, through innovation and creative interventions, the pre-colonial systems and their attendant institutions, practices, and values. As Khan and Manzares in 2006 rightly observed, initiatives towards recovering the lost knowledge systems and moral fiber were signaled by the continent-wide strategy in the form of the new Partnership for Africa's Development and the popularized idea of African Renaissance. The rationale behind the drive to promote and support African indigenous knowledge systems is the understanding that the systems and their related practices are highly adaptive to rapid changes as they are embedded in people's popular cultures. This is echoed in the description of the nature of African IKs by Catherine Odora Hoppers as being about exploring indigenous technological knowledge in agriculture, fishing, forest resource exploitation, atmospheric management techniques, knowledge transmission systems, architecture, medicine, and pharmacology, and recasting the potentialities they represent in the context of democratic participation for community, national, and global development. Close quote. This points to the instrumental role that the African IKS could play, if creatively harnessed, in helping to end what the great African political economist Badi Odimode termed Africa's dependent development syndrome. For PRA, the retrieval and recentering of IKS in the African formal education system would greatly help the continent to acquire intellectual sovereignty. This is informed by his understanding of indigenous knowledge systems as, and I quote, bodies of historically formed and locally engendered knowledge that is distinctive, societally relevant, characteristic of a given culture or society, and defined by age-long acquired practices, skills, and proficiencies, and know-hows of people used in their everyday existence to sustain their mode of livelihood. Close quote. Khan and Manzares in 2006 echoed a similar view when arguing that the African indigenous knowledge systems appeal to the collective shared cultures and of the people and highlight the significance of the historical context in which past practices are relevant to today's era. This implies the need to tap into people, both as individuals and groups, as agents of change, to help them to help with the creative and innovative adoption and adaptation of African IKS to the modern day era. This would, however, require that the same agents to have a reliable and deep knowledge of IKS and its appreciation, and therefore be fully accustomed to IKS-based practices and their relevance. They should also be appropriately skilled and empowered to serve as agents that are able to creatively tap into IKS and harness IKS to solve today's problems and challenges. They therefore need to be patriotic about this. As is the case with other forms of knowledge, African IKS is culturally specific, and therefore much of its richness not only derived from but is also proficiently expressed and shared through culturally anchored indigenous languages. This does not, however, imply that African indigenous knowledge, or indeed any other knowledge, and its relevance are necessarily limited to its cultural and linguistic boundaries. As Olujime Adeshina, our colleague here at UNISA, who actually mentioned in 2006, all knowledge is context-specific and therefore endogenous by its very nature, while its universality is guaranteed through its relevance to humanity. This cements the point made above regarding the centrality of language to all indigenous knowledge and its development. The use of the concept language is here based on the broad understanding of as defined by Buchok, that language is the main cultural practice, not restricted to the use of words, but also including all sign and symbol systems through which meaning is produced and communicated. Therefore, if language is an embodiment of indigenous knowledge, then any study that seeks to examine the question of the indigenization of education through the integration of indigenous knowledge would remain incomplete if it failed to consider the question of language, its present status, and its development and its role in society. This begs the question to all of us. What does the current body of knowledge say regarding the indigenous African languages in South Africa? And what implication does this have in terms of indigenization of education through African IKS? I now wish to turn my attention to this important question, Vice Chancellor. Key amongst the contributors on the subject of language in South Africa is one of the foremost language experts in South Africa, the late Neville Alexander. In one of his earlier writings, during the immediate post-94 period, Alexander notes with great concern the historical and continued neglect of the continued neglect of the country's indigenous African languages. This, he argued, led to a language crisis that manifested itself in Africans who, because of lack of proficiency in English and Afrikaans as high status languages, could not compete in the labor market. This was compounded by the fact that, as far as indigenous African languages are concerned, no serious links have ever been made with culture, science, and technology, effectively reducing these languages to non-scientific and underdeveloped status. This consequently led to a syndrome, according to Alexander, led to a syndrome of the colonized mind, evident in a lack of self-esteem and the belief that African indigenous languages do not have the words for most of the modern objects and scientific concepts, leading to a perceived need to learn English to overcome the language deficit. This syndrome of the colonized mind, articulated by Neville Alexander, is best exemplified by the Afro-pessimists such as Mqashu, who in 2006 expressed a skeptical view about the introduction of indigenous African languages in the curriculum as media of instruction and the likelihood of this helping to contribute to economic development and the improvement of living conditions of all South Africans. According to Mqashu, those advocating for promotion and the use of indigenous African languages are simply driven by their discomfort with English, which they perceive to be the language of slavery and oppression. Those advocates, claims Mqashu, are not in tune with the practical realities on the ground, i.e., that for the majority of ordinary people in Africa, English is the global language of economic opportunities they wish to learn and in which they want to become proficient. For Mqashu, any attempts to introduce and implement language in education policies to promote the indigenous African languages would be made difficult by a strikingly powerful status of English in most South Africa's educational institutions and in the world of business and commerce, and the accompanying limited and/or non-implementation of new language policy in education. That's Mqashu's view. Moreover, Mqashu is skeptical of what he calls the disjuncture between the policy intentions and practical realities that attest to Jonathan Johnson's theory of political symbolism. The realities he cites are based on the findings he made in a number of African countries, that is Namibia, Tanzania, and Kenya, where English is preferred over indigenous languages as a medium of instruction. This is due to indigenous languages in Africa being underdeveloped and therefore are lacking in technical elaboration and standardization, as well as in resources such as unqualified teachers and limited teaching and learning materials. Other pessimists who echo Mqashu's view or analysis are Chetty and Mwepu, who argue that English, if well taught beyond transmission of basic linguistic skills, by integrating issues of cultural heritage, personal growth, cultural studies, and new literacy studies, would have an emancipatory effect on black learners. This, they argue, is so because English serves as an important vehicle for socio-economic cohesion for people who are susceptible to being divided along ethnic lines, ethno-linguistic lines, and that it is a linguistic bridge for communication amongst black South Africans in changing society. And furthermore, that English constitutes an essential tool for success in the global world. So Chetty and Mwepu here basically argue for promotion of English which they see as necessary amongst Black South Africans to avoid ethno-linguistic conflicts, and also as the language of business globally. The suggestions by these researchers that English is an emancipatory language is, however, and I argue, not supported by evidence. My own experience as an academic in South Africa, in South African universities, the time that spends over 2 decades, close to 3 decades, suggests the opposite, that English, and indeed teaching in any additional language other than the mother tongue or home language, is inhibiting to effective learning and intellectual development. I recall when I was teaching at the Northwest University, Mafikeng campus, where the overwhelming majority of students are Black African, my late fellow colleague and friend, Professor Mkhahlane, suggested that we start reflecting on and writing about the experiences of our students with English in the university. In an email that he sent to us as his colleagues in the sociology department then, on 21 April 2015, he wrote, and I quote, "Dear colleagues, I'm marking sociology second year scripts, and I've come across some humorous sociological gems, such as," and he cites them as follows: "The middle classes are the pretty bourgeoisie," not petty bourgeoisie, the pretty bourgeoisie. A mental disorder is when a person's mind does not operate 100%, but operate half. Sometimes this is caused by headache or meningitis. Mental disorder makes a person a very stupid person. Conflicts and functionalists work at macro level, which deals with larger people, not small people, close quote. Evidently, these gems, as Professor Mkhahlane humorously described them, littered as they are with spelling and grammatical errors, plus poor conceptual content, led us to some very serious learning challenges faced by Black African students who are having to learn in a foreign language. We also know the present challenge in our country of children said to be reading without understanding or meaning. And the most recent effort by the government to address this through Basic Education Amendment Act of 2024. This evidence discredits any view that promotes English as a second or sole medium of instruction. Between 2016 and 2019, while I was an academic at the University of Limpopo, I observed just how much damage the promotion of English through our schooling has inflicted on Black African students' proficiency in their own indigenous home languages. This became more evident when I was a member of the High Degrees Committee responsible for quality assurance and assessment of master's and doctoral students' research proposals. The committee insisted that all the proposals for research to be conducted in Black communities are ethically required to provide translated versions of their research instruments from English to the relevant African indigenous language of the targeted community. As members of the committee, we often notice with deep shock how students battle to perform correct translations from English to their language, to their indigenous language. Note, for instance, the following examples extracted from some of the proposals, and no names are mentioned here, and no specific title is mentioned. I quote a few. One of the English question phrased in English said, "What are the services you offer to orphans and vulnerable children in the center?" The student translated as follows: Centera ya lena e nea ditirelo dife, ditirelo tša mohuta ofe go bana ba ditšhiwana le ba bokoa. Note that these are some of the words used are not Sepedi as such. They are Tswana, for instance, Tswana. The correct translation should be, e ka ba ke ditirelo dife goba ditirelo tša mohuta ofe tšeo di abelwago ke sentara ya lena go bana ba ditšhiwana le bao ba sa bolokegago. Another one is, what is your view on the use of African indigenous medicine to treat and care for HIV and AIDS? The student translated as follows. Na kgopolo ya gago ke efe mo tšhomišong ya dihlare tša bogologolo tša setšo mo go okafatšeng le go alafa bolwetši bja HIV AIDS? Obviously, this also has got some grammatical problems. The correct translation will be, go ya ka wena, o be o bona jwang taba ya go šomiša dihlare tša setšo sa maAfrika go okobatša goba go lwantšha le go alafa bolwetši bjo bja HIV AIDS. Another one, last example, it says, do people in your community believe that African traditional medicines can help in the treatment and care of HIV/AIDS? The student translated as follows. Na batho ba na le tshepo yeo e tletšeng mabapi le tšhomišo ye ya dihlare tša setšo gore ruri di ka okafatša le go alafa bolwetši bjo bja HIV/AIDS. The correct translation, and much more sounder one, will be, na batho ba motse wa geno ba a dumela gore dihlare tša setšo sa maAfrika di ka thuša twantšhong le go alafeng ga bolwetši bja HIV/AIDS. So you can see these are really practical challenges. Close quote. That English as a medium of instruction presents serious challenges to Black African students was confirmed by the Human Sciences Research Council report of 2007, compiled in partnership with the Limpopo Department of Education and the University of Limpopo and Irish Aid. The study conducted in Limpopo province examined the literacy, teaching and learning at the lower primary school level, with a specific focus on grades 1 to grade 4. It was prompted by the disturbing poor results in literacy and numeracy amongst learners in South Africa between 1999 and 2002, and by the global recognition of the social injustice whereby children from the marginalized communities are required to learn in the language of the dominant and the powerful. Also recognized was the need to appreciate that for learners to realize cognitive development in bilingualism or multilingualism, they need and I quote, a solid mother tongue or first language development and consolidation followed by a very sound development of the second language, but does not replace the mother tongue for cognitive development purposes. As our recently departed and beloved Dr. Zulu Matavo Zulu used to say, referring to the power of language and culture-based knowledge anchored in languages, that is, language and its potency resides in the mother's breast milk. That's the power of language. The question then is, how can indigenous African languages be harnessed? I argue that an Afro-optimistic approach is an answer, as I shall illustrate in my critique of Afro-pessimism. Afro-pessimistic views, discouraging calls for the reclamation and affirmation of African languages, and the African IKS itself, represent what PRA considers as a challenge in post-independent African societies marked by a reluctance to deconstruct inherited educational and curricular systems. He described this as an inertia and an unspoken willingness due to lack of political will. Aristides calls this Afro-pessimistic mental barricades. Pra attributes these Afro-pessimistic views to a deeply entrenched myth that knowledge can be accumulated and imparted only through colonial languages. Pra dismissed this myth in his argument that the idea that worthwhile education can only be acquired through English has got to be challenged and shown to be a pernicious brake on social and on individual progress. Similarly, Alexander argued that no nation can achieve the highest levels of economic and cultural development through the medium of a second or even a third language. Countering the Afro-pessimists, several Afro-optimistic language scholars have provided a range of helpful suggestions on how best to advance indigenous African languages for educational and development purposes. Neville Alexander called for a language policy for the redress of language inequalities in line with the principle of multilingualism, since in South Africa, foreign languages, i.e. English and Afrikaans, acquired a higher status of development through subjugation and conquest. Such policy would need to support the development of historically neglected indigenous African languages. He was optimistic about the issue as the principle of multilingualism was enshrined in the Constitution and the 1995-96 Language Plan Task Group, LANGTEC, which was tasked with advising the then Minister of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology about the development of National Language Plan. Evidently informed by these suggestions emanating from the scholarly discourse and in further support of the 1995 Constitution and the LANGTEC, the democratic government introduced a number of additional instruments meant to steer further the development of indigenous African languages. This included the establishment of the 1994 National Language Service, the 1995 Pan-South African Language Board, the 1997 Language in Education Policy, the 2002 Language Policy for Higher Education, the 2003 National Language Policy Framework, and the 2004 Indigenous Knowledge Systems Policy. Notwithstanding this elaborate set of instruments and framework, later reviews revealed a general failure on the part of the government and its statutory agencies to effectively implement policy towards the full realization of the ideals of a vibrant multilingualism, language equity, and language rights, and their contribution to South Africa's development. BX in 2009 attributed this failure to both governments' lackluster approach to policy implementation because of the work of statutory bodies such as PENSALP and NLS has not been entirely credible, and the hegemonic position of English and negative attitudes regarding the functional uses of African languages. BX argues that this has led to a great concern about the state and fate of the indigenous African languages, to the extent that the 2003 Ndebele Committee on the development of these languages as a medium of learning and teaching arrived at a pessimistic conclusion that the future of the languages would remain bleak unless a comprehensive language plan was developed and effectively implemented. This was aggravated by what BX correctly considers a decisive factor, i.e., the negative attitude among Black Africans towards their languages, their instrumental value, and their high status functions. She sees this in the minimal use of indigenous African languages in South Africa, which is also evident in schools where Black African parents prefer to send their children to former white schools for what they perceive as a better education through which their children would be able to acquire the language of aspiration, of social mobility, that enhances better labor market opportunities, which is English. This attests to Dr. Zuluma Tabuzulu's study on children and dolls in South Africa, and also to Agri Cluster, the late Agri Cluster's lament of what he termed the apartheid maxim that says, white is better, black is not. While these challenges regarding the development of indigenous African languages may sound overwhelming, it is not all doom and gloom, I wish to argue. There are signs of hope, such as the confident view expressed by Alexander when he proclaimed that history has shown that all languages are capable of being developed through liberal borrowing from neighboring and high-status languages, as exemplified by English, which developed by borrowing extensively from Greek, Latin, and French, as well as from other lexical and morphological imports. Such a development requires what Pra has called the intellectualization of indigenous African languages. By intellectualized languages, Pra refers to a language that has both the oral and the literate social base, being a written language. He argues that it should be technically and terminologically equipped language suitable for educational purposes. That is intellectualized language. It should also be able to deal with scientific, technical, philosophical, and abstract thought. To arrive at this level of development, Pras argues that the languages concerned should have elaborately developed discipline-specific terminology, e.g., for mathematics, chemistry, and psychology, that enables them to be translated into media of teaching and learning, and that they should be legitimized and applied by societal institutions such as schools, the judiciary, and the legislature. While it is indeed true that indigenous African languages in South Africa have been historically underdeveloped and therefore warrant concerted efforts towards their development into intellectualized languages, it would be incorrect not to acknowledge that they were never completely neglected, even if it was not intentionally so. In my recollection, as one of the millions of black South Africans whose schooling was completed under apartheid Bantu education system, which was designed to be inferior in quality to white education, I can attest to the unintentional consequences of this education system, at least in terms of the opportunity it ironically provided or afforded for the partial development of indigenous African languages. To illustrate this point, I cite a few examples of the evidence of development in my own language group, Sepedi, that was used in the former Bantustan of Leboa, now integrated with the former Bantustans then known as Kazangulu and Venda, into the present-day Limpopo province. It needs to be emphasized that this evidence of development, or at least partial language development, was not peculiar to Sepedi language only, but was indeed a reality in all the other indigenous African languages in South Africa, with similar kind of evidence to support this. Under Bantu education, black African communities had an opportunity to develop some literacy bases for their languages, as is evident from the wide range of written books and novels used for teaching and learning, even right up to matric, or what is today known as grade 12. An example of some of the well-written Sepedi language textbooks include Mahlontibe, published in 1986, authored by M.J.S. Madiba, which was used to teach grammar at primary school level. Other examples are grammar textbooks such as Segageshu, authored by M.B. Noganing, and Marema Kadika, just a Sotho Saleboa, by J.R.D. Goma, published in 1979. And novels and poetry books by a renowned prolific author, O.K. Mazepe, Oliver Khadima Mazepe. These books included Khorong ya Moshad, which was published in 1962, Leshita Piri, Todia Dinosi, published in 1968, and Mahlatsi a Madimabe, 1981, by the same author. This is all in the middle of, or in the high days of apartheid. Beyond the grammar textbooks, novels, and short story books by Black African authors, there were also school subjects translated, or that were translated from English into indigenous African languages for teaching and learning. This included mathematics, which we call Dipalo, natural sciences, which we call Tuta Mahlale, health sciences, which we call Mapelo, and geography and environmental studies, Jadikulo, we call it Jadikulo. We learned through these indigenous African languages in school in those days. The significance of this range of teaching and learning materials I've just cited above is that they highlight the existence of a scientific vocabulary in the indigenous African languages, although there has not been a concerted effort to nurture and develop these languages further. Today, serving as a further testimony to this, are the books such as authored by the late Dr. Zulu Matavo Zulu, titled The Sesotho Dictionary of Mathematics, published not too long ago in 2012. As Zulu pointed out, the book serves as evidence of the African origin of mathematical knowledge, with close to 500 pages of mathematics texts that cover algebra, trigonometry, geometry, as well as engineering mathematics, such as calculus and differential equations and statistics in Sesotho language, close quote. Also, as testimony in this direction, there is a theoretical paper that I published in 2018, through which I teased out and showcased a rich body of indigenous theoretical insights and concepts on youth in African languages, and in particular using proverbs. And this continues to be the project that I'm embarking on to unravel the indigenous African theoretical contributions and theories. I therefore would confidently argue that apartheid's separate development policies and the attendant Bantu education, which were designed to marginalize Black Africans to the positions of labor for whites, turned out to be somewhat a blessing in disguise. They had an unintended consequences, as they provided a space for various Black African language communities to develop their respective languages for educational purposes. Of course, this was incomparable with the immense resources channeled for the development of Afrikaans. The result has been that these languages ended up meeting some of the prerequisites for intellectualized languages as articulated by Prof. That is, having both the oral and literate basis, social basis, and some discipline-specific terminologies. Another prerequisite, according to Prof, is that of a need for institutional support for the African languages. Such institutional support, I dare argue, partially existed under apartheid, despite the fact that its policies were not intended to genuinely empower Black Africans. The partial existence of the required institutional framework is evident in social institutions such as schools, training colleges, Bantustan governments, Bantustan judiciaries, Bantustan universities, all of which made elaborate use of indigenous African languages with some combination of English. And note that this is not to justify necessarily or legitimize Bantustan apartheid system. We need, and I argue, we need to build on these early foundations, albeit in a radically transformative ways, as opposed to how this was actioned under apartheid. In so doing, we would be seriously heeding the advice that the late former president of the African National Congress and the eminent leader of our liberation struggle, O.R. Tambo, once gave to the ANC in exile in 1977 when he said, and I quote, "Comrades, you might think it is very difficult to wage a liberation struggle. Wait until you are in power. I might be dead by then. At that stage, you will realize that it is actually more difficult to keep the power than to wage liberation war. People will be expecting a lot of services from you. You will have to satisfy the various demands of the masses of our people. In the process, be prepared," and this is a very crucial advice he gave. "In the process, be prepared to learn from other people's revolutions. Learn from the enemy too, or also. The enemy is not necessarily doing everything wrong. You may take his right tactics and use them to your own advantage. At the same time, avoid repeating the enemy's mistakes." And I believe after 94, we should have actually learned some of how things were done under apartheid, which were correct, and maintain some of them and develop them even further while we are eradicating the system of racial discrimination. Another sign of hope lies in the findings of a study among undergraduate students at the University of KwaZulu-Natal by Khan and Manzaris in 2006, through which they found that while the majority of these students, mainly Black Africans, displayed lack of awareness of African indigenous knowledge and cultural practices, such as the knowledge of indigenous health practices and medicines, an overwhelming majority, however, supported the idea of learning and being taught through indigenous African languages at all levels of the study. This finding is affirmed by the later developments in South Africa, where students embarked on a nationwide protest demanding an end to colonial education, as aptly captured by the slogan, #Rose Must Fall. In conclusion, what I've done in this lecture today has been to use an Afro-optimistic approach to examine and illuminate the possibilities and opportunities available to us to indigenize and decolonize education using African languages. This approach was necessitated by the persistent dominance of Western education system in South Africa, with little or no significant content derived from the indigenous African knowledge systems. In using this approach, I sought to contribute to the counter-hegemonic knowledge discourse that affirms and supports African indigenous knowledge systems as appropriate intervention for the redress of past injustices, as well as to decolonize. This scholarship, the counter-hegemonic knowledge discourse, contributes to efforts meant to end Africa's dependent development, as decried by Badi Odimode. A view that no nation in the world has ever managed to obtain or attain highest levels of development through dependence on foreign languages must be seriously considered. And I think here China is just an example, and other East Asian countries like Japan, where they insist, when you send the students there, they insist that they should learn their home languages or the indigenous languages for 6 months before they can actually be integrated and begin to learn. other things that they visited for. My observations are a clear demonstration of the inhibitive effect of learning in foreign language on students' ability to acquire the knowledge and the skills for effective and innovative contribution to sustainable development of our nation. Hence, a need to never give up on efforts to invest in further development of African languages, as they have both the oral and literate social basis, as I've demonstrated, and the discipline-specific terminologies necessary for further development into languages of science, education, and business. Thank you so much for your attention.
Professor Huling Linkabula, Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Professor Moloko Sipota, Acting University Registrar, Professor Zito Nikosi, Executive Dean of the College of Human Science, my esteemed friend Professor Mokong Simon Mapadimeng, Professor of the Department of Sociology, family, friends, and colleagues of Professor Mapadimeng, members of the university community, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm here with you to share my thoughts and comments on one of the important and socially relevant topic that is titled as Indigenization of Education through African Languages in South Africa, an Afro-optimistic perspective. This is a professorial inaugural lecture by Professor Mapadimeng Mokong Simon, presented at the University of South Africa. The word language is a miniature of human consciousness, that is thoughts, and it is said that thoughts makes life. If you see the significance of thoughts, we will know that how crucial the role of language in our lives, as it directly connects with our thought processes. I think language is not just a medium, it is a tool for oppression as well as freedom. However, it depends on who is holding the power to govern the language and its politics of accommodation, particularly concerning the marginalized groups all over the world. Given this context, I will shed light on a few crucial aspects of the presentation by Professor Mapadimeng. This thought-provoking presentation by Professor Mapadimeng really inspires faculty and a teacher, particularly having a base with sociology of oppressed groups. I really appreciate and I believe that this presentation extends beyond academic pursuits and represents a fundamental social responsibility of every citizen who considers their nation as a mother. I would like to offer few key arguments that Professor Mapadimeng presented in his presentation. As far as the key arguments are concerned, Professor Mapadimeng has taken a view that in the process of growing colonization of education and the politicization of language, he commended the lecture's focus on African indigenous knowledge system. And he also addresses how the politics of language effects on the marginalized groups, particularly the Black Africans, through language barriers. Basically, the presentation is based on Professor Mapadimeng's thorough research and qualitative observations. Professor Mapading has taken a stand and explored two perspectives with reference to Afro pessimism and Afro optimism. Really, if one think that the role of language, how the role of language and its entire politics is governed by the ruling class. And it is in this context, if we see the presentation made by Professor Mapading, we'll come to know that the lecture and the presentation shows and expands beyond academic value, wherein he tries to explore how the language, particularly English language, affects Black students' learning outcomes. This is very important to note that in a given context, when we consider learning outcome is an essential base of any pedagogy or any education system, how really, how truly English language as a primary language of instruction hinders learning amongst the Black students. Really, if one study the various issues related to politicization of language, with special reference to South Africa, it shows that our students are slowly detaching from their traditional ethos, traditional cultures, when it has an impact through language. And there is a risk of fostering a false consciousness imposed by the dominant class. So we have to understand both the dialectics which is involved in the presentation made by Professor Mapadimeng. I also observed that how language as a tool of power operates, especially in the nations that were colonized. However, the presentation also explored the concept of language as a politics and social injustice. If we see from the perspective from below and perspective from above, we will clearly understand that the distinction and the debate that Professor Mapading would like to extend here. Children from marginalized communities are forced to learn in the language of the oppressor that is really creating a barrier to education. While presenting both the perspectives, especially particularly Afro pessimism, Professor Mapading compared the contrasting perspectives. Afro pessimist scholars tries to perpetuate the myth that knowledge can only be acquired through colonial language. At the same time, Afro optimist scholars advocates for African languages in education and development. If you see the internationalization and globalization of education, in the name of such post-capitalist educational models, I often realize that studies like Professor Mapadimeng is an eye-opening for many of scholars. I also would like to mention here that there are studies in Indian context and the findings of the Indian scholars, particularly with special reference to the topic selected by Professor Mapading, is closely associated and endorses the truth. I also agree with Professor Mapadiming's argument as far as the implementation challenges of African indigenous knowledge systems in education. The presentation also highlights the government's and an entire system's failure to effectively implement the African indigenous knowledge system into education, because we have various constructive policies, but when it comes to the implementation part, the system, the psychology of system, as Foucault mentions, the concept of governmentality, who govern the power and how they govern people, especially the marginalized groups, through various practices, through various lenses. So here I personally believe that language plays a crucial role in the development and especially the cognitive development of a child. And when it comes to the Black African children's, it really affects, it seriously affects their socialization into academics as compared to the counterparts. I would like to also mention here that Professor Mapading, in his presentation, suggested a few suggestions, particularly intellectualization of indigenous languages. I consider it an important initiative and one proposed solution for intellectualization of African languages into transforming them into languages of higher learning through concerned and concrete efforts made by various stakeholders. In Indian context also, the national education policy that we have adopted recently explicitly focuses on the use of mother languages in education, research, and I, being a professor at the university, I would like to mention here that without state cooperation, without the governing community's cooperation, this task will not be achievable. It is difficult to achieve this task, and therefore we need a holistic efforts from all the stakeholders. In the light of above context, Professor Mapading's presentations shows an important aspects and also throws a seriously academic thought in this debate. On International Mother Language Day, UNESCO examined that 40% of the world's population lacks access to learn in their mother languages. This alarming statistics underscores the urgent need for progress in mother tongue. It is in this context the present presentation also highlights the importance of incorporating African Indian indigenous knowledge system in education that addresses critical importance to the topic, as well as I also would like to mention that language has been a powerful tool of operation, and by promoting African languages in education, we can work towards a more equitable and inclusive future. In concluding remarks, I would say Professor Mapading's lecture presented a compelling case for the inclusion of African indigenous knowledge system through a counter-hegemonic knowledge discourse. I endorse the fact that by promoting indigenous languages, educational opportunities can be expanded and a long history of cultural suppression through language can be addressed.
On behalf of the Council, the Vice Chancellor and Senate, we welcome Professor Mokong Simon Mapadimeng to the community of academic giants, community of elders, community of scholars, community of full professorship. We congratulate you, Prof, on having reached such a significant milestone in your life and particularly in your academic career. Thank you for sharing such a fascinating and highly educational presentation. What I learned from the lecture is that there are possibilities and opportunities available to us for indigenous for the indigenization of education using indigenous African languages. Professor Mapadimeng, taking some advice from O.R. Tambo's statements, indicates that not everything about apartheid was wrong, and that we need to pick the right tactics and build from there. This is for me such a profound statement. There are indeed, as Professor indicated, a list of literary works that were produced during the apartheid regime. And that is indeed a sign that indigenous language development started some time ago. We surely do not have any reason not to fast track the process of transforming our education system using African languages and elevating them to be used as languages of learning and teaching. Thank you once more, Prof. Mapadimeng. Thanks are also due to Prof. Ngosi for her kind introduction of Prof. Mapadimeng to us. Thank you, Prof. Patel, for responding to the lecture. And thank you to all of you who joined us in this ceremony. Allow me to thank all colleagues who made it possible for us to be here. Colleagues from DIA, colleagues from ICT, colleagues from the media, colleagues from facility management, colleagues from protection services, colleagues from cleaning services, and colleagues from the college. We have now come to end of the session, and we thank you for this, and good evening.